Joseph Greenblatt was born in Warsaw in 1915. The words you're about to hear are drawn from his own testimony, recorded in 1996.
I was born in Warsaw, Poland, in 1915, a time when the world was still at war. Though I would not understand what that meant until much later. My father was Samuel Greenblatt, though he was also known by his Hebrew name, Israel. He was a businessman, a man of principle, and above all, a Polish patriot. He had served under Marshal Pilsudski, and that service meant something to him. It meant he had fought for a free Poland, for a nation that he believed would treat all its citizens with dignity. My mother, Czarna Greenblatt, ran our household with warmth and determination. She kept our home, raised us with love, and tried to shield us from the ugliness that existed beyond our door. I had two older siblings, my sister Helena and my brother Sigmund. We were a Jewish family, and at home we spoke Yiddish, the language of our hearts, our traditions, our prayers. But when we stepped outside, we spoke Polish. That was the language of the streets, of school, of the wider world we lived in. And I attended a school where I was often the only Jewish child in the classroom. I remember sitting at my desk, feeling the eyes on me, hearing the whispers. Even as a boy, I understood that I was different in their eyes, that I carried something that marked me as an outsider. But my father's pride in Poland, his belief in the country he had served, gave me strength. As I grew older, I became deeply involved in the Zionist youth movements. I believed in a Jewish homeland, a place where we would not be the outsiders, where we would not have to prove our worth. I joined Betar, and later I became active in the Jewish military organization. These were not just social clubs, they were movements that taught us discipline, courage, and the belief that we had the right to defend ourselves. Before the war came, I was a university student. I studied law at the University of Warsaw, walking those grand halls, debating with my classmates, imagining a future as an attorney, perhaps even a judge. My father's connections, his service under Pilsudski, opened doors that were often closed to Jewish men. In 1937, I was accepted into the Polish Army's officer training school. It was an honor, a rare achievement. I completed my basic training and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. I wore that uniform with pride, even as I watched anti-Semitism spreading through Poland like a poison in the 1930s. The rhetoric was growing harsher, the restrictions more burdensome, the hostility more open. Jewish students were forced to sit in separate sections at the university. Jewish businesses were boycotted. There were beatings, threats, graffiti on walls. And yet, despite all of this, Warsaw's Jewish community remained vibrant and alive. We had our own theaters, our own schools, our own newspapers and cultural institutions. We had welfare organizations that cared for the poor, the sick, the elderly. We had life, rich, full, defiant life. I never imagined it could all be taken away. In 1939, as summer turned to autumn, the drums of war grew louder. I was mobilized again, called back to active duty as tensions mounted. We were sent to positions near the German border, and we waited. We trained, we prepared, and we waited. And then, on September 1st, Germany invaded. I cannot adequately describe what it was like, the suddenness, the violence, the complete chaos. The German forces came at us with overwhelming firepower. Their aircraft filled the skies, dropping bombs that shook the earth beneath our feet. There was sabotage behind our lines, confusion in our command structure. We had no chance. The Polish army, for all its courage, was simply overwhelmed. We retreated, falling back under constant bombardment, watching our positions collapse, watching our comrades fall. I was wounded during the retreat. The details blur together now, the pain, the blood, the confusion. And then I was captured. I became a prisoner of war, held in Germany under conditions that were deliberately harsh. The German guard separated the Jewish officers from the non-Jewish ones immediately. We were marked, isolated, treated differently from the very beginning. The cold was bitter, the food scarce, and every day brought new humiliations. But months later, through contacts with the Polish underground, brave men and women who risked everything, we managed to escape. We made our way back into occupied Poland, traveling by night, hiding in barns and forests, dependent on the kindness of strangers who could have turned us in at any moment. We moved like ghosts through a country that no longer belonged to us. I returned to Warsaw in March of 1940. I will never forget walking through those streets again, seeing my city transformed. The Germans were everywhere, their uniforms, their flags, their commands barked in a language that grated against my ears. But my family was still alive. I found them, held them, thanked God that we were together. My mother wept when she saw me. My father gripped my shoulders with trembling hands. Helena and Sigmund embraced me. We were together, but everything had changed. Soon after my return, the Germans began constructing the walls. Brick by brick, they were building a prison around us. The Warsaw Ghetto was being closed off from the rest of the city. Streets that had been open were suddenly blocked. Buildings were sealed. And then came the orders: all Jews were to move into the designated area. Families that had lived in certain neighborhoods for generations were forced to abandon their homes, their belongings, everything they had built. We were moved into a small apartment that we shared with multiple families. The overcrowding was immediate and unbearable. Where once a single family had lived comfortably, now 10 or 15 people squeezed into the same space. Privacy disappeared. Dignity became a luxury we could no longer afford. And then came the hunger. Food became scarce, rationed, impossibly expensive. People grew thin, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. Children with swollen bellies wandered the streets, begging for crusts of bread. Disease spread rapidly in those conditions. Typhus, especially, swept through the ghetto like wildfire. The lice that carried it were everywhere, and there was no escape. I contracted typhus myself. For days I lay burning with fever, drifting in and out of consciousness, certain that I would die. But somehow, my body fought through it. When I finally recovered, weak and skeletal, I saw the full horror of what the disease was doing to our community. Corpses lay in the streets, sometimes for days, because there was no one with the strength to move them, and the Germans had stopped all normal burial procedures. I volunteered to help carry bodies to the cemetery. It was grim, exhausting work, but it was necessary. We could not allow the Germans to photograph our dead lying in the streets. They would use those images for propaganda, to show the world that Jews were dirty, diseased, less than human. We would not give them that satisfaction. So we carried our dead with whatever dignity we could muster. Inside that sealed ghetto, I reconnected with members of the Jewish military organization, the ZW. We were a smaller group than the larger Jewish fighting organization, but we were determined, disciplined, and we had military training. We began building an underground network, cell by cell, contact by contact. We stockpiled weapons that we smuggled in from the Polish side: pistols, rifles, ammunition, grenades. Every weapon was precious, purchased at enormous risk and astronomical cost. We infiltrated the Jewish police force and the labor departments, placing our people in positions where they could gather intelligence, where they could warn us of German actions, where they could sabotage the machinery of oppression from within. And through these networks, we learned the truth, the terrible, unbelievable truth that the Germans were working so hard to hide. The Jews who were being deported from Warsaw, loaded onto trains and told they were going to labor camps in the east, they were not going to work. They were being taken to a place called Treblinka, and they were being murdered there. All of them. Men, women, children, the elderly, the sick, everyone. The Germans had built factories of death, and the trains that left the Umschlagplatz were carrying our people directly to their graves. We distributed warnings throughout the ghetto, printed leaflets, spoke to anyone who would listen. But many people would not, believe it. How could the human mind accept such a reality? How could anyone believe that a modern, civilized nation would systematically murder an entire people? It was too monstrous, too evil. Many chose to believe the Germans' lies instead, because the alternative was simply too horrific to contemplate. On July 22, 1942, the mass deportations began. The Germans called it a resettlement action, but we knew what it really was. Every single day, thousands of people were rounded up, driven through the streets like cattle, and brought to the Umschlagplatz, the assembly point near the railway sidings. From there, they were loaded into boxcars, packed so tightly they could barely breathe, and sent to Treblinka. Families were torn apart in moments. Parents were separated from children. Husbands lost sight of wives in the chaos. Hundreds upon hundreds of children simply disappeared, taken from hospitals, from orphanages, from hiding places. The streets echoed with screams, with pleas for mercy that went unanswered. German soldiers and their collaborators moved through the ghetto with ruthless efficiency, checking papers, dragging people from their homes, shooting anyone who resisted. My family hid wherever we could, in attics, in cellars, in secret rooms behind false walls. We moved constantly, never staying in one place too long. My sister Helena's husband had been killed earlier in the war, shot while trying to flee east ahead of the German advance. Now she lived in constant terror that she would be taken, that we all would be taken. It was during this dark time, surrounded by death and destruction, that I married my wife Irene. We held the ceremony in her mother's apartment, a small room in the ghetto. Fighters from our organization stood guard outside while a rabbi spoke the ancient words. There was no celebration, no feast, no music, but we stood under the chuppah and made our vows, and in that moment, we affirmed life in the face of death. We chose hope when there seemed to be no reason for hope. We chose to believe in a future, even though we could not imagine what that future might hold. After the initial wave of deportations, only tens of thousands of Jews remained in the ghetto, mostly young people, those who had work permits, those who had managed to hide successfully. The Germans had murdered the majority of Warsaw's Jewish population in a matter of months. But those of us who remained knew that our turn would come. We would not go quietly. In January 1943, when the Germans returned for another deportation action, we were ready. This time, when they entered the ghetto, Jewish fighters opened fire. It was the first time armed Jews had shot back at German forces in Warsaw, and the Germans were completely unprepared for it. They retreated in confusion. The action was halted, and in that moment, we learned something crucial: the Germans could be resisted. They could be fought. They were not invincible. After that January battle, we prepared intensively for what we knew would be the final confrontation. We gathered uniforms, taking them from captured German soldiers and Polish police. We accumulated weapons, more pistols, rifles, even submachine guns. We manufactured our own grenades in secret workshops, filling bottles with gasoline and explosives. We stole ammunition from German workshops where some Jews were still forced to work. We ambushed individual German soldiers and took their weapons. Every bullet was counted, every grenade cherished. We fortified positions throughout the ghetto, creating bunkers, preparing escape routes through sewers and basements, stockpiling food and medical supplies. We trained constantly, drilling our fighters in street combat tactics, teaching them how to move through ruins, how to set ambushes, how to fight from buildings. We knew we could not win, not in any conventional sense. The Germans had tanks, artillery, aircraft, and unlimited manpower. We had perhaps a few hundred fighters with light weapons. But winning was not the point. The point was to resist. The point was to die fighting rather than be led like lambs to the slaughter. The point was to show the world, and to show ourselves, that Jews would not go quietly into the night. April 19, 1943, Passover Eve, the night when we traditionally celebrate our ancestors' liberation from slavery in Egypt. It was the night the Germans chose to liquidate the ghetto once and for all. They entered at dawn with a large force, SS troops, Wehrmacht soldiers, Polish and Ukrainian collaborators, all heavily armed and supported by tanks and armored vehicles. They expected to complete their work quickly, to round up the remaining Jews within a few hours and have the ghetto empty by nightfall. Instead, they were met with fierce resistance from multiple positions throughout the ghetto. We opened fire from windows, from rooftops, from carefully prepared bunkers. We threw grenades and Molotov cocktails at their vehicles. We ambushed their patrols. The Germans fell back in shock and confusion. This was not what they had anticipated. This was not how Jews were supposed to behave. For weeks, we fought them. Every street became a battlefield. Every building became a fortress. The Germans brought in artillery and began systematically destroying the ghetto, setting fire to buildings block by block. They used flamethrowers to burn us out of our hiding places. The smoke filled the sky, turning day into night. The heat was unbearable. The air became difficult to breathe. We moved through the ruins like phantoms, using sewers and underground passages to shift from position to position. We struck and then disappeared before the Germans could respond. We saved our ammunition, making every shot count. We dragged our wounded through narrow tunnels, refusing to leave them behind. Many of our fighters died in those weeks. Brave men and women who chose to stand and fight rather than submit to deportation. They died in burning buildings, in last stands when their ammunition ran out, in collapsed bunkers, in the streets they had grown up in. Their names should be remembered. Their courage should never be forgotten. I survived through luck, through determination, through the network of hiding places and escape routes we had prepared. As the ghetto burned around me, as the Germans blasted apart building after building, I moved through the shadows, always one step ahead of death. When the uprising finally ended, when the ghetto was nothing but smoking rubble and scattered corpses, I managed to escape to the Aryan side of Warsaw through the sewers. The Warsaw Ghetto was completely destroyed. The Germans razed it to the ground, leaving nothing but ruins as a warning to anyone who might think of resisting. But we had fought. We had resisted, and that could never be erased. After escaping the ghetto, I continued resistance activities. I will not detail everything I did. Some things remain sensitive even now, decades later, but I can say that I worked with groups fighting the German occupation until the war finally ended. When liberation came, when the guns finally fell silent, I emerged into a world that had been completely transformed. Poland was devastated. The Jewish community that had flourished for 1,000 years had been almost completely destroyed. My family, the vibrant streets of Jewish Warsaw, the theaters and schools and synagogues, all gone, murdered or scattered across the world as refugees. In the years immediately after the war, I helped smuggle weapons for the Irgun, the Jewish resistance organization fighting for independence in Palestine. I believed then, as I believe now, that Jews needed their own state, a place where we would never again be helpless, never again be dependent on others for our survival. My wife Irene and I eventually made our way to Belgium, where our daughter was born. We tried to build a new life there, to find some peace after so many years of war. But in 1950, we immigrated to the United States. We settled here, in this country that had been a distant dream during those dark years in the ghetto. I worked various jobs, learning a new language, adapting to a new culture. Eventually, I opened a travel agency, a successful business that allowed me to provide for my family, to give my daughter opportunities one could never have imagined during the war. But I never forgot. I devoted much of my later life to Jewish organizations, to preserving the memory of the uprising, to telling our story so that the world would know what happened. I am an old man now. Most of those who fought alongside me are gone. The witnesses are disappearing, one by one. Soon there will be no one left who remembers the smell of the burning ghetto, the sound of gunfire echoing through empty streets, the faces of friends who never came back. But the story must continue to be told. My story, our story, is one of loss. Yes, terrible, unimaginable loss. But it is also a story of resistance, of courage, of the refusal to submit to evil without a fight. We were outnumbered, outgunned, facing an enemy with overwhelming force. We knew we would probably die, but we chose to fight anyway, because some things are worth dying for. Dignity is worth dying for. Freedom is worth dying for. The right to exist as human beings is worth dying for. I survived when so many did not. I lived to see Israel become a nation. I lived to raise a family, to work, to build a life in freedom. But I carry the ghetto with me every day. I carry the faces of those who died. I carry the weight of being a witness, the responsibility to remember, to testify, to ensure that the world never forgets.